Next, please welcome to the stage Teresa Hutson, Corporate Vice President of Technology for Fundamental Rights at Microsoft, Michael Phillips, Director of Technology, Strategy and Relationships at AARP, and Sally Radwan, the United Nations Environment Program Chief Digital Officer. This discussion on digital inclusion and underserved populations will be moderated by FP's Vice President of Research for FP Analytics, Dr. Maisha Alam.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation with three experts who really are going to help us understand the connections between ensuring digital inclusion for all and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and why that matters and how we get there. Before I get started, just a couple of really quick reminders. We welcome audience questions, and so if you'd like to participate in the discussion, please feel free to submit your questions. If you are in the room, there's a double-sided card with a QR code that you can use. Let's dive right in. Thank you again for being here. And Michael, I'd love to start with you. You are at AARP, where you lead the work on technology and strategy and how to think about digital inclusion. So, as you know, we're here in New York during the UN General Assembly. The Sustainable Development Goals are, of course, very high on the agenda. Can you help our audience understand how is digital inclusion connected to the 2030 agenda, and what role does it play in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, and I think, first of all, thank you for having us here. We really appreciate it, Maisha, and thank you for all your work at FP in thinking about inclusion in the digital world in a different way. Of course, digital inclusion, the digital world undercuts all the SDGs, starting with the first three: ending poverty, ending hunger, health and welfare. You can see how people who aren't connected, who don't have access to the information, the essential resources, and all of the amazing innovation that's coming down the pipe, would be at a disadvantage, even a further disadvantage. We're seeing, here in developing nations as well as in the global South and other developing worlds, that as organizations and partnerships like Microsoft and their Airband initiative are bringing the infrastructure and affordability to communities, it opens up access, but then it raises additional barriers, such as skills, such as design, such as language barriers, and so forth, that also need to be addressed. The other way that I think we're seeing more and more digital inclusion is going to be important for meeting all of the 17 SDGs are in the underlying AI for Good programs that are being developed. Underserved populations, whether it's underserved for age or ethnicities, gender, or economic underserved communities, they're just not part of the data pools that are being used to create societal benefit in this amazing world. So we have to make sure that that everyone has access in order to be included in these. And I know Microsoft has. I'm probably stealing Teresa's thunder.
We talked ahead of time, so you did take my talking.
So I apologize.
No, I'm totally kidding. Totally kidding.
Of course, AARP is not a technology organization, and we see every month new amazing ways that organizations like Microsoft are using the advanced models to address that.
Yeah, and that's a perfect place to pick up and continue the conversation. And there's a lot you touched on that I think we can unpack, and I'm looking forward to discussing the AI for Good, what this means in terms of who needs access the most and how do you sustain access and build confidence and ensure utilization of this technology. But I do want to pick up specifically, Teresa, with you about the Airband initiative. Microsoft is at the forefront of the innovation and implementation of this work, and really bringing access to people across the world, hundreds of millions of people across the world, and especially in Latin America and Africa. And let me ask you this. What have been some of the lessons learned and key factors that programs like the Airband initiative have brought for you? And, as you're establishing them within local communities, how are you thinking about scaling?
Yeah, and I think the way the Airband initiative has worked, which is basically it's our goal to extend meaningful connectivity around the world, and we have said we will extend with partners connectivity to 250 million people by the end of 2025, including 100 million in Africa. But of course, we don't do that by ourselves. And that's the really important lesson, I think. We have to work with partners. We have to work with partners who build the technology that extends connectivity. We have to work with partners who understand the local communities, to understand how do you serve the needs where you are going. So if we're going into Ghana and we are working with, the Hunger Project, we work with a local community center and center it in women who use the local community center. So I think it's the way, and then we use what we have done to then advocate for change at scale. And so what that means, for example, what we did in the United States is we did this work with a lot of partners while we used that to kind of prove the case to advocate, among others, with partners for significant infrastructure funding for connectivity. And so we think that's the way to go, because Microsoft by itself and even our internet partners and the NGOs we work with, they're not going to fund connectivity by themselves. We do need significant infrastructure funding for it.
Yeah, and this piece about building the infrastructure, having the funding and the financing to make that be sustainable, I think, is a really important point, and one where I think, Sally, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. In addition to your former role as an advisor to the Egyptian Minister for ICT, you've also worked across a range of multilaterals on developing ICT frameworks. And I'd love to hear from you, what do you see is the role of policy and regulation to creating those enabling environments? And what have you seen also to be some of the hurdles in terms of ensuring investments are being targeted and reaching where they need?
That's a great question, and thank you again for inviting me today. It's great to be here. So when I was growing up in Egypt about 30 years ago, there was this saying that in 10 years or so from then, if you don't know how to use a computer, you just don't belong in this world. You won't know how to survive. And that kind of turned out to be true to some extent, but fast forward 30 years and we're kind of saying the same thing about AI and emerging technologies, right? So in Egypt, when we started developing the AI strategy, and as you said, there was a piece that was internal, but also working with international organizations to see how we can govern this thing and what help we can get, frankly. And we did work a lot with Microsoft. It became evident very, very quickly that in the, I'll call it the West, just being politically incorrect, there was this big debate around the AI race, the global AI race. Thankfully, we don't really seem to use that term that much anymore, but 2019 or so, it was everything. And I'd go to some of these fora and I'd say, well, how can you talk about a race if not everyone is starting from the same point? It's not a race. And yes, you have a handful of countries that are talking about how do we upskill our labor force so they don't lose their jobs and become AI engineers instead of, I don't know, something else that can be automated. In the global south, it's a very different conversation. It's how many people can't read and write? How many people have to learn math? How many people have to learn computer science? And then how many people can be educated on AI? It's a much, much steeper pyramid to climb. And so we developed this framework consisting of two pyramids, because we're a nation of pyramid builders. And one of them was for technical skills, which do have a pretty substantial breakdown themselves. But the other one was for non-technical skills, research, domain experts, policy, et cetera, et cetera. And what we're also seeing is that none of this can be done, as you said, without the proper infrastructure, be it data, be it connectivity, being compute, but also that you can't really make the argument for infrastructure by itself. You have to link it to the development agenda. You have to link it to the use case. we had a side event during UNGA on digital public infrastructure, and we had a colleague from the Kenyan government, and the first thing he started talking about was digital payments, digital identity, digital education, all the things that this infrastructure enables. So I'll just end here and say that we absolutely need to link the infrastructure agenda and the environmental agenda, because now I work for UNEP, to the development agenda. Otherwise, we just won't get very far in the Global South.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you hit on so many important points. But I think the other thing that's really important about what you said is, who are we talking about here, and how are their lives going to be different and better, right? And that, I think, is a really important kind of reality check and level setting aspect to this discussion. And Michael, I'd love to turn to you and build on some of the points that Sally touched on. And when we think about the building blocks of what it's going to take, not just to get the infrastructure in place and not just to make sure the technology is accessible, but that it's utilized, talk a little bit about digital skills and digital literacy and inclusive design. You know, these are all equally important when it comes to the uptake. And, you know, at AARP, you are, of course, thinking about older adults and what that means in terms of economy, the health of communities, and, of course, of the labor force as well. So many different aspects here. But when we think about individuals and communities in particular, where does, you know, the skills, the literacy, and the inclusivity in design come into play?
Yeah, and you know, those are all great points. And the interesting thing is, there's not one solution that works across all of these different barriers, and nor do they work across different types of technology sectors or hardware, software, or parts of the globe. So it really, as Teresa was mentioning, it really does take partnerships who understand their role, their swim lane, working together in order to bridge the gap. I'll give one example. An affiliate of AARP's is Oats and Senior Planet. We provide training to older adults nationwide here in the United States. And the model that has worked is sort of a three-legged stool. We have to have the boots on the ground in communities who know the community and can provide the hands-on training that people are looking for in order to develop their higher digital skills. It requires curriculum developers who understand how, with the accelerated pace of technology, what's needed in those communities. Is it basic skills? Is it workforce skills? Is it health and wellness skills? Is it media literacy skills? And designing the right curriculum for the right audience. And then it requires funders at a higher level, whether it be government or tech sector, private sector, who have a vested interest in greater adoption, all working together. That's a lot of partners working together towards goals just to raise digital literacy in specific communities. And you multiply that times all of the different barriers that people face in underserved communities in getting to the level that we're talking about, where people feel very confident about using the tools that are available.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as I'm listening to you speak, something that comes to my mind is also, how do we know what we know, and how do we update our approaches, our beliefs, based on the evidence that's presented to us and that we find along the way? And, you know, this is also the social scientist in me thinking about data and evidence gaps. And Teresa, I'd love to bring you back into the conversation, and in particular ask you about exactly this. How are you leveraging data to inform your strategy and to shape your cross-sectoral partnerships? What does that look like in practice?
I think it's a couple things. I mean, you know, we always try to figure out where we can bring data to help see a problem. And I think that's where it's the most kind of useful thing. And so with the connectivity work, but not just the connectivity work, we built a digital equity dashboard for the United States that, you know, maps where their people are connected, but it also overlays additional demographic data. And so then you have a really different picture, and you can do better targeted intervention or funding or whatever you need to do. You can do things better. I think we are also just discovering really interesting new ways of using data, whether it's, we were doing a lot with global satellite imagery, you know, where we can sort of see things from the sky that we couldn't see from the ground. And sometimes that's, you can't get up close because of geographic limitations. Sometimes it's, scary things are happening on the ground. But also, I mean, just as an example, it's slightly different from this topic, but we're using it to document the war crimes in Ukraine. And so we can see impact to infrastructure, we can see impact to hospitals, we can see impact to schools and water towers and things like that. And this is just a really interesting new way of thinking about what can you see from the sky that you can't see from the ground. But for a lot of the work that we're talking about on digital inclusion, I mean, it's really just figuring out how you layer data sets, working with partners who can ask you the key questions. Because I think that's one of the things that is really clear. Like, we think about things and with the data we have available, but when somebody says to us, can you see this problem? Like, do you have a way of looking at this problem that we don't know how to look at? And so we can do that. And I think it just really helps you ground your conversation. It helps you ground your approaches to trying to start to address problems.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And when we think about addressing problems, and again, as I'm listening to you speak, I actually think back to an earlier conversation this morning that was taking place a little while ago. And going back to this issue of the role of technology and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, we had the Danish tech ambassador talking, and she was making some really important points about the potential of technology and the potential of AI in particular, but also being really frank and saying, look, these are political, social, economic problems, and we shouldn't think that there's going to be a technology silver bullet, right, to solve all of these things. And while that is true, and for sure that is true, there's also really important questions that are being asked right now in terms of what will artificial intelligence leveraged and deployed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals look like. And that's something that I think each of you have touched on. And so this is a question for all of you to elaborate on, because I do think it's top of mind for a lot of people, which is when we think about digital inclusion, where do opportunities lie in terms of the role of AI? How can people understand what that will mean and feel excited and optimistic about it as well, instead of just trepidation?
Yeah. Do you want me to
go ahead?
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a really, really good question. And I think one of the places we've seen sort of the most well, first I will just say we need connectivity. Otherwise, people aren't going to be served by AI. We need electricity, then we need connectivity. Otherwise, AI is not going to serve. I mean, the digital divide just gets broader. But where we've seen some really, really great examples is around accessibility for people with disabilities. There's an app where you can kind of just hold it up and you can see the world, and it will describe to you what you're seeing. And so you can imagine, I don't actually have it on my phone because it's in preview, but I could hold it up and it would describe this. It would just describe the room to me. Which is really cool. Think about it if you're in your closet and you're trying to find your red shirt. There is a service where you can call and have a human volunteer currently that will tell you your red shirt is 3 over from the corner. But if you don't want to invite a human into your closet, it might be cool if you could just use your smartphone. Similarly, for people who are neurodiverse, the ability to process a lot of information, to summarize a lot of information. There's just some really, really exciting use cases for individual people, and then I think there is this ability to see the world from the sky that is, using AI technology to help us understand things like deforestation, that helps us understand almost immediately after a disaster strikes where the harm has really hit people the hardest. We saw, if you saw maps on the New York Times about the damage in Lahaina, describing how many buildings had been affected by the fire, that came from the partnership we have with Planet. And so there's some really, really cool stuff. We just need to target the work that way.
Yeah, and if I may, I'd actually love to pick up on this point about the environment. And Michael, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but Sally, you also talked about this a little bit earlier in terms of environmental degradation, sustainability. And so I guess this is actually a question for both of you in many ways. When I think of the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, and I know it's something that all three of you have worked on, and he outlines what are the most important issues that we as a global community need to be thinking about and addressing. Digital inclusion is one of them, and what does it look like, and what is it going to take to get the internet in the hands of everybody on Earth, every single person, that's his goal, but also climate change and the realities of accelerating climate impact. And so where did these two pieces come together? And I'm specifically thinking about not just the most vulnerable communities, especially in low and middle income countries, but also, again, who are we talking about? Older adults who are uniquely disadvantaged or may need to have access to certain things in terms of their ability to be resilient in the face of those. So would you both come in on that and how you're thinking about these dual challenges?
Oh, thank you. Let me give you a couple of examples of things we're doing at UNEP. And of course, the UN Environment Programme is about more than climate. So we look at climate, nature, which is biodiversity, and pollution. So I'll give two examples of two systems we have. And I'll make the point that what we actually need is two things: collaboration and governance. And so the first one is called the International Methane Emissions Observatory, which is an online platform that tracks methane emissions around the world and using AI and machine learning, and gives early warnings for methane hotspots once they are generated, so that we can send alerts to member states so they can deploy their mitigation measures. And it's actually been deployed successfully in a number of countries so far. The other one is called Countermeasure, which is, those of you who were at the SDG Action Weekend might have seen me present that, which is a very cool little project that was implemented by one of my colleagues in Asia to detect plastic pollutants in rivers. And the beauty about it is that it doesn't only utilize cutting-edge technology, computer vision, and so on, and tries to trace all the plastic pollutants to the source so we can actually stop the problem before it happens, but that it also involves the local community. So there's a citizen science aspect to it. When we detect a hotspot for plastic pollution, we contact the school and they send a whole class of students to that river to pick out the plastic pollutants and remove them. So there's an element of education there as well, and involving the local community in this. The challenge is, how do we scale these? How does the local community around the Niger River in Africa know that we're doing this for the Ganges in Asia? Mm-hmm. And this is where I see part of the role of the UN is as a convener of these types of solutions and capabilities. And of course, the other side is governance, where we need to build bridges between existing governance structures and help where they don't exist, mm-hmm. as opposed to trying to develop something that works for everyone everywhere.
Michael?
Yeah, I want to reference some AARP research that came out last week, citing how unprepared older adults are in the United States for natural disasters, and how unconnected people are to the trusted sources that can provide preparedness information, as well as how to react to fast-moving natural disasters. And if people aren't connected here in the United States to those trusted sources, certainly globally the connection rates are even lower. Things are moving faster now. The climate change is clearly a lot of change that we all have to be connected to. And we know that if we're not connected to the most up-to-date information, we're not prepared. We don't have those types of information sources that are trusted in the age of misinformation. Mm-hmm. It's going to cause deaths in some cases, not just natural disasters, but epidemics, pandemics, wars, and so forth. So the underserved there again are put at a disadvantage in these situations. The second thing I wanted to say, with regards to global change, there's a lot of evidence that decarbonization is directly tied to economic affluence in communities, and there's a lot of new data coming out globally that communities that are and actually, Maisha, I think you touched on this on some of your research with FP, that communities that are adopting digital skills in the workforce are have increased profitability and economic abundance in those communities. So that's a faster path. That's a pathway to decarbonization, I believe.
Yeah, and actually, thank you for evoking some of the research at FP Analytics that we've been able to do in partnership with AARP. And I think, listening to you speak, one of the things that I'm reminded of is, what does this mean in action in terms of gender disaggregated data, age disaggregated data, the urban and rural divide? And you're right, across the board, there is evidence to demonstrate that potential. But I think it's also a matter of identifying interventions that are targeted for the intersectional challenges that people are facing. And so we know, for example, that older women are going to be facing unique challenges, and in many ways, certain things that are disproportionate in terms of the burden that they carry, right? And so there too, digital inclusion has a really important role to play in not just alleviating, but also unleashing the potential that those communities hold. Michael, you touched on something that I think is so important, and thank you for bringing this up, because I hadn't been thinking about it backstage when we were talking, but I do want to take a minute to address, which is disinformation. And this is a huge challenge. We all know this in a number of ways in terms of democracy and faith in institutions and so on and so forth. But also when we're talking about digital inclusion and the ability and willingness of underserved populations to trust and effectively utilize technology once they are connected, disinformation is a significant barrier, and one that is concerning in many ways. And so I love, again, this is a question for all of you, and maybe Teresa, you'd like to go first, but I'd love to hear how you're thinking about this and also trying to address that challenge.
It's a big question. I'll go fast. I won't cover everything. One, I think when we think about getting people online for the first time, we're doing a lot of thinking about, okay, what kind of tools do you need to equip people with to make sure they understand what, sort of arena they've entered, so that they're, better consumers of information. We do a lot of partnerships to think about media literacy. And then we're really thinking about where are the places in which our technology has the potential to make things worse or better. And, really thinking a lot about, like, what can you build into the products? What can you build into the technology to help people have better signals about what they're consuming? Can we use AI to detect deep fakes, for example? Yes, but eventually the AI will catch up with itself and won't become undetectable. So how do we start to give people signals that something is trustworthy rather than looking for the deep fake? So can you build in watermarking? Can you start to help people look for something like the equivalent of the lock that you look for when you look for a secure website? So we're thinking about this in lots of layers, thinking about it with specific populations, kids, aging adults, people around the world. It's a super complicated problem that we need to keep at, because it's very, very important.
Michael?
Yeah. And echo everything Teresa said, and I think this week there's been a lot of conversation about this that I won't repeat, but I will say our research shows that older adults who don't trust technology won't use the technology. Mm-hmm. And speaking personally, the thing that worries me the most, just as personally, there's so much amazing innovation that's coming down the pipe using artificial intelligence to help older adults with different stages of life. And if there are bad actors that are giving a bad reputation to artificial intelligence as a whole, my personal concern is that it could taint the good use cases for AI that are out there.
Sally?
So it's a huge problem for the environment, especially for climate change. There is a lot of misinformation, disinformation out there. What we're doing about it is we're actually building a large language model, and I'm personally not a big fan of LLMs per se, but we are building one because we think this is a legitimate use case to be able to answer questions about the environment and about climate change from authoritative sources, mm-hmm. so that people can actually find the right information with the stamp of approval of the UN. So hopefully that will help.
Thank you. And I think those are some great examples in terms of trying new approaches and seeing how they work. But as you said, Teresa, realizing that this is an evolving problem and we don't yet have a full grasp of it. And so our approaches need to be agile as well.
Just don't trust what you see on the internet, right? Without verifying. Verify. That image might not be true.
Yeah. Let me see if there are any questions from the audience that we can take before we wrap up. Yes, and if you wouldn't mind, actually, would you like to help? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a fascinating panel. I really enjoyed it. I'm Sunita Nadamuni. I used to be at Dell until recently, leading global social innovation. We were working with Government of India on developing a technology platform for non-communicable disease screening, and it enrolled about 300 million people. So we were really interested in seeing how it can be taken to other countries. Right now, the technology part seems to be very straightforward because DPGs, DPI, that's there are institutions that will help you take the technology. But as all of you have been saying, the hard part that we spent in the last 5 years were building the ecosystem, working with all the institutions, the program guidelines, policy, laws, the training on the ground. There are no frameworks for that, right? But without that, you can't, without assessing the digital maturity of other countries, it seems like you're just going to set it up for failure by saying, oh, you have a DPG here, Government of India wants to give it as a DPG, we take it there. So I wanted to understand your thoughts about what efforts are going on in that space, because I think that's really important.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great question.
Anyone want to jump in?
Sure. So, yes, totally agree. And one of the things we're doing, and I'm not saying this will solve everything, but part of this World Environment Situation Room that we're building, one of its purposes is actually to allow that exchange. It won't solve the problem of lack of DPIs or DPGs in certain countries, and it won't solve the regulatory problem, but at least it will show what's possible, and it will facilitate the exchange of technology, capacity, and financing. So hopefully that's a step, but like I said, it won't solve everything.
Well, and I think your point is also really well taken in terms of where we started this conversation, the types of partnerships and cross-sectoral collaboration that are going to be required and the role that governments have to play in that effort, right? How do you create an enabling environment, and how do you ensure that the types of work that each of you are trying to steward can flourish, and that the policy environment and regulatory environment exists to enable that work? So
yeah, and just real quickly, the only thing I can say that we've tried is putting together kind of the learnings after we do these pilot programs, putting together a playbook. We've just published with USAID how to get more women online based on the lessons we've learned from the partnerships. I don't know if that actually gets to it. I think lots of people have tried that. But we're trying not to sort of say we don't know how to do it all the time, but when we learn stuff, we'll share it.
Yeah.
And I think that's super important for everybody in the room is to when you learn something that works, just share it in case it works for somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we are unfortunately out of time, and it's a really rich conversation. We've touched on so many different topics, and I think also speaks to how complex this agenda is, but also the many, many opportunities for partnership and collaboration. So thank you to each of you for the work that you are doing and for participating in today's discussion. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Teresa, Michael, and Sally.
Thank you. I almost just fell.
And now please welcome